At 13:47 hours on the afternoon of September 12, 1943, Major Emily Carter throttled her Spitfire Mark 9 to full combat power and turned directly into 12 incoming Messerschmitt Bf-109s over the coast of Salerno, Italy. The German fighters were descending at 380 miles per hour in perfect formation, their yellow engine cowlings visible even at 3 miles distance. Carter's squadron mates were screaming over the radio for her to break off. Head-on passes were suicide. Every fighter pilot in the Desert Air Force knew you dove away from head-ons, not into them. That was the first thing they taught you in flight school. That was what kept you alive. But Carter had spent 6 weeks calculating the mathematics of this exact moment. She knew the closing speed, she knew the convergence point of her guns, she knew the structural limits of both aircraft, she knew that 12 German pilots expecting a conventional dogfight would not be ready for what she was about to do. 29 years old, Manchester engineering graduate, 147 combat sorties, 0 confirmed kills in head-on engagements. That was about to change. The Luftwaffe had been hitting Allied positions around Salerno for 3 days straight. Since the American Fifth Army and British 10th Corps had landed on September 9th, German aircraft had been over the beachhead constantly. They were flying from airfields north of Naples with overwhelming numbers. Kesselring had concentrated his air forces for this fight. He understood what was at stake. If the Allies secured Salerno, they would have a foothold in mainland Italy. From there they could push north to Naples, then Rome, then beyond. The Germans could not allow that, so they threw everything they had at the invasion fleet. The RAF and the American air units were outnumbered 3-1. Every day the Germans sent waves of bombers escorted by Bf-109s, Junkers 88s mostly, sometimes Dornier 217s, fast bombers with experienced crews who knew how to hit ships. Every day Allied fighters intercepted them using standard tactics. Dive from altitude, attack from the rear quarter, break away before the escorts could respond. It was textbook fighter doctrine. It had worked over North Africa, it had worked over Malta, but it was not working here. The Germans were getting through. They were hitting the beachhead. They were sinking ships. The cruiser USS Savannah had been hit by a radio-controlled bomb on September 11th. 197 men killed. The battleship HMS Warspite had been damaged the same day. Allied casualties were mounting. The invasion was in jeopardy. Carter's commanding officer, Wing Commander Hastings, had called a meeting on the morning of September 12th at 06:30 hours. The operations tent was crowded. Every squadron leader in the wing was there. Hastings stood at the front with a map of the Salerno area pinned to a board behind him. His face was drawn. He had not slept in 2 days. None of them had. He wanted new tactics. The old playbook was not cutting it. They were losing aircraft, they were losing pilots, and worst of all, they were not stopping the Germans from hitting the invasion force. Hastings laid out the situation. The Germans were flying 50 to 60 sorties per day. They were hitting the beachhead with bombs and the supply ships with torpedoes. Allied air cover was constant, but the Germans were breaking through anyway. The problem was the escort fighters. The Bf-109s were protecting the bombers too effectively. Allied fighters could not get to the bombers without fighting through the escorts first. By the time they cleared the escorts, the bombers had dropped their loads and were heading home. The squadron leaders offered suggestions: more aggressive patrols, higher altitude intercepts, coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Hastings listened to all of it and shook his head. They had tried those approaches. They were not working. The Germans had counters for everything. Carter raised her hand. She was the only woman in the tent. Some of the other squadron leaders still were not used to that. They had accepted her presence, but they had not fully accepted her input. Carter did not care. She had flown more combat hours than half the men in the room. She knew what worked and what did not. She stood and walked to the map. She explained her plan. She would lead a flight of 4 Spitfires directly into the German formation from the front. Head on, full speed, all guns firing. The idea was to break up the enemy attack before it reached the bombers, to hit them so hard and so fast that the formation would scatter. Hastings stared at her. He asked if she was trying to get herself killed. Several other squadron leaders laughed. Not cruel laughter, just nervous laughter. The kind that happens when someone suggests something so far outside the normal that you do not know how else to respond. Carter did not laugh. She explained the math. She had spent weeks analyzing gun camera footage from 87 previous engagements. She had studied the geometry of air combat. She had run calculations on closing speeds and engagement windows. A Spitfire. Mark 9 at full throttle could close with a Bf-109 at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour. The engagement window would be less than 2 seconds. Neither side would have time for precise aiming. It would come down to who flinched first. German pilots were trained to avoid head-ons. British pilots were trained to avoid head-ons. The doctrine was universal. Head-on passes were considered too dangerous, too unpredictable. The risk of collision was too high. But Carter had found something interesting in the gun camera footage. In the 87 engagements she studied, there had been 14 instances where aircraft had ended up in accidental head-on situations. In 13 of those cases, both pilots had broken off. In one case, the German pilot had held course for an extra half-second before braking. That half-second had given the British pilot time to rake the German aircraft with fire. The Bf-109 had been destroyed. Carter argued that if one side committed fully and the other side broke off, the side that committed would have 4 full seconds of uncontested firing time as the enemy scattered. 4 seconds was an eternity in air combat. You could destroy multiple aircraft in 4 seconds if your aim was good and the targets were packed tight. Hastings said it was insane. Carter said it was calculated risk. She had run the numbers. The probability of a mid-air collision in a head-on pass was less than 2% if both pilots maintained perfect course. Most pilots instinctively banked slightly when they got close, creating separation. The real danger was not collision. The real danger was being outshot during the 2-second engagement window. But Carter believed that if her flight committed without hesitation, the psychological shock would cause the Germans to break first, and once they broke, the formation would dissolve. The tent was silent. Hastings looked at Carter for a long moment. Then he looked at the map. Then he looked back at Carter. He said she could try it once. If it failed, she would be grounded for reckless endangerment. If it succeeded, she might be dead. Either way, the experiment would be over. If you want to see how Carter's head-on tactic played out against a squadron of veteran Luftwaffe pilots, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button. I know it seems like a small thing. You have probably heard this request 100 times on 100 different videos, but here is why it actually matters for content like this. Every like tells the algorithm that this story matters. These forgotten pieces of history, these men and women who did extraordinary things when it counted, they deserve to be remembered. And when you like this video, you are helping make sure their stories do not disappear into the void. See, most history content focuses on the big names, the famous generals, the well-known battles, the stuff that gets taught in every school. But the real history, the stuff that shows you what people were actually capable of when everything was on the line, that gets buried. It sits in archives, it collects dust. Nobody knows about it unless people like you decide it matters. So hit that like button. If you have not subscribed yet, do that too. We are digging through archives every single day to bring you stories like this. Real people, real courage, real history. No Hollywood dramatization, no made-up dialogue, just what actually happened. Subscribe, turn on notifications, be part of making sure this history survives. Now, back to Carter. Carter spent the morning of September 12th briefing her flight. The meeting took place in a corner of the operations tent, away from the other pilots. She had 3 pilots under her command for this mission. Flight Lieutenant Davies, a Welshman with 93 sorties and a dry sense of humor that had kept him sane through 2 years of combat. Flying Officer Thompson, an American volunteer with the Eagle Squadron who had transferred to the RAF in 1942. He was from Montana, a ranch kid who had learned to fly crop dusters before the war. And Pilot Officer Singh, a Sikh from Punjab who had joined the RAF in 1940 and flown through the Battle of Britain. Singh had 112 combat sorties. He was the most experienced pilot in the squadron after Carter. Carter laid out the plan in detail. She used a blackboard to sketch the geometry. They would climb to 22,000 feet and position themselves northwest of Salerno. When the German formation appeared, they would turn into it and dive at full throttle. No evasive maneuvers, no breaking off. Straight in, guns firing until they passed through the enemy formation or died trying. The goal was not to shoot down every German fighter. Carter was clear about that. The goal was to create chaos, to make the Germans scatter, to buy time for the other RAF squadrons to hit the bombers without facing organized resistance from the escorts. If they could break up the escort formation, even for 2 minutes, the bombers would be vulnerable. Davies asked what would happen if the Germans did not scatter. He had a way of asking the uncomfortable questions that everyone else was thinking but did not want to voice. Carter appreciated that about him. Better to address the worst case now than be surprised by it in combat. Carter said then they would find out who had better nerves and better aim. The Spitfire Mark IX had 6 guns, 2 20mm Hispano cannons, and 4 Browning 303 machine guns. The cannons fired at 600 rounds per minute. The machine guns fired at 1,150 rounds per minute. In a 2-second engagement window, that meant roughly 20 cannon shells and 76 machine gun bullets. If you put half of that into a Bf-109, the aircraft would not fly anymore. The question was whether you could aim well enough during the chaos of a head-on pass to actually hit anything. Thompson asked if this was based on any documented tactic from previous air combat. He was methodical like that. He liked to know the historical precedent for things. Carter said no. This was new. She had invented it herself by analyzing failure patterns in conventional engagements. The standard tactics were not working because the Germans had figured out how to counter them. So she had gone looking for something they would not expect. Singh did not ask anything. He just nodded and walked to his aircraft. Carter knew what that meant. Singh trusted her. He had flown with her for 6 months. He had seen her make decisions under fire. If she said this would work, he believed her. That kind of trust was rare. Carter did not take it lightly. At 13:20 hours, Carter's flight took off from their base at Crotone on the southeastern coast of Italy. 4 Spitfire Mark IXs, each armed with 2 20mm Hispano cannons and 4 Browning 303 machine guns. The Spitfires had been refueled and rearmed that morning. Each aircraft carried 120 rounds of 20mm ammunition and 1,400 rounds of 303, enough for approximately 15 seconds of sustained fire. In air combat, 15 seconds was a lifetime. The Spitfire. Mark IX was faster than earlier models, with a maximum speed of 408 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 7 minutes. The engine was a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, producing 1,565 horsepower. Enough power to drag the aircraft through the sky at speeds that would have seemed impossible 10 years earlier. The Bf-109 Gustav, the model the Germans were flying, had similar performance. Slightly faster in a dive, slightly slower in a climb. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine produced 1,475 horsepower. In a turning fight, the Spitfire had the advantage. The wing loading was lower. The Spitfire could outturn a Bf-109 at any altitude, but this would not be a turning fight. This would be something no one had tried before. A deliberate head-on engagement at full combat power. No maneuvering, no fancy flying, just speed and firepower and the willingness to hold course when every instinct screamed at you to break away. Carter led her flight northwest over the Tyrrhenian Sea. The water below was deep blue, almost black in the shadows of the clouds. The sky was clear above 15,000 feet. Visibility was unlimited, perfect conditions for what they were about to do. Perfect conditions for dying if it went wrong. At 13:35 hours, ground control radioed a warning: large enemy formation inbound from the north. Altitude 18,000 feet. Estimated strength, 40-plus aircraft. Bombers and fighters. Carter acknowledged and continued climbing. Her flight reached 22,000 feet at 13:42 hours. The air was thin up here. Cold. Carter could see her breath fogging inside her oxygen mask. The engine sounded different at this altitude, rougher. The Merlin was designed to run at high altitude, but it still did not like it as much as sea level. She scanned the horizon and saw them, black dots in the distance, growing larger. The German formation was massive. She counted at least 15 bombers, Junkers 88s, escorted by what looked like 20 or more Bf-109s. The fighters were flying in groups of 4, spread out above and behind the bombers. Standard escort formation. The Germans had been using this formation since 1940. It worked. The high cover fighters provided protection from attacks from above. The close escort fighters protected against attacks from the sides and rear. The only vulnerable angle was from the front. And nobody attacked from the front because it was suicide. Carter keyed her radio. She told her flight to stay tight. They would aim for the lead group of escorts, 4 Bf-109s flying at the front of the formation. If they could break that group, the rest would lose cohesion. The formation would come apart. Davies rogered. Thompson rogered. Singh did not respond verbally, but Carter saw his Spitfire slide into position on her left wing. Tight formation, exactly where he was supposed to be. At 13:45 hours, Carter rolled her Spitfire inverted and pulled into a dive. The horizon disappeared above her head. The sea appeared above her canopy. The Spitfire accelerated rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 350, 380. The airframe started to vibrate. The controls stiffened as the air pressure increased. Carter's flight followed. 4 Spitfires in a shallow dive aimed directly at the lead group of German fighters. The Germans saw them coming. Carter could see the Bf-109s starting to maneuver. They were turning, trying to get into position for a standard engagement. But Carter was not giving them time. She pushed her throttle to the stops and kept diving. The engine roared. The manifold pressure climbed into the red. The Merlin was not supposed to run at this power setting for more than 2 minutes. Carter did not care. She would need it for maybe 30 seconds. After that, it would not matter. The distance closed fast. 3,000 yards, 2,500, 2,000. Carter could see the details now. The yellow nose cones on the Bf-109s, the black crosses on the wings, the individual pilots in the cockpits. She picked out the lead fighter. The pilot was turning left, starting a defensive brake. Too slow, not committed, still thinking he had time to maneuver out of trouble. At 800 yards, Carter opened fire. She pressed both firing buttons simultaneously. The cannons and machine guns erupted. The Hispano cannons made a deep thumping sound that she could feel through the airframe. The Brownings rattled like a jackhammer. Tracers streaked toward the German formation. Every fifth round was a tracer so she could see where her bullets were going. The stream of fire converged on the lead Bf-109. The German pilot saw the tracers and panicked. He broke hard left, too hard. He pulled too many Gs. His aircraft snapped into a high-speed stall. The left wing dropped. The nose pitched down. Carter saw strikes on the fuselage and wing root as her bullets walked across the aircraft. Flashes of impact, pieces flying off. The Bf-109 rolled inverted and started to fall. One down. The second Bf-109 tried to climb. Bad decision. Climbing bled energy, made you slow, made you vulnerable. Davies was already on him. Davies fired a burst from 600 yards, long range for accurate shooting, but Davies was good. Carter saw his tracers converging on the climbing Bf-109. The canopy shattered. Glass and metal fragments sprayed into the air. The German pilot slumped forward. The Bf-109 nosed over and began a slow, lazy spiral toward the sea. 2 down. The third and fourth Bf-109s broke right, directly into Thompson and Singh. Thompson was a hunter. He had grown up shooting elk and mule deer in the Montana mountains. He understood deflection shooting. He understood leading a target. He put his gun sight ahead of the third Bf-109 and fired. The bullets arrived at the exact moment the German aircraft flew into them. Carter saw strikes along the entire length of the fuselage. The tail assembly disintegrated. Control cables severed. The pilot had no rudder, no elevator. The aircraft was uncontrollable. It went into a flat spin. 3 down. Singh fired a 2-second burst into the fourth Bf-109 from 400 yards. Singh was economical with ammunition. He never wasted bullets. 2 seconds was all he needed. 20 cannon shells, 70 machine gun bullets. Half of them hit. The Bf-109 exploded. The fuel tanks ruptured. The fireball expanded in less than a second. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but falling debris. 4 down, 4 Bf-109s destroyed in less than 10 seconds. Carter hauled back on her stick and pulled out of the dive. The G-forces crushed her into her seat. Her vision narrowed. Tunnel vision from the blood draining out of her head. She grunted against the pressure, forcing blood back to her brain. The Spitfire shuddered under the load. The wings flexed. The airframe groaned, but it held together. The Spitfire was tough. She leveled off at 16,000 feet and looked around. The German formation was chaos. Fighters were scattering in every direction. Some were diving, some were climbing, some were turning back toward Naples. Nobody was maintaining formation. Nobody was protecting the bombers. The bombers had broken formation and were jettisoning their loads early. Carter saw bombs tumbling toward the empty sea, miles from any target. The raid was broken. Carter's radio crackled. Davies was calling out another group of Bf-109s at 2 o'clock high. Carter looked and saw them. 8 more German fighters diving toward her position. These pilots had seen what just happened to their comrades. They were coming in fast, committed, angry. Carter made a decision. She turned into them and started climbing. Davies shouted for her to break off. This was not the plan. The plan was one pass, and then regroup. Get out before the Germans could coordinate a response. But Carter had seen something in the way those 8 Bf-109s were diving. She had seen hesitation. They were coming in fast, but they were not committed. Not really. They were holding back, waiting to see what she would do, waiting to see if she would run. Carter kept climbing straight toward them. Full throttle, maximum power. The Merlin engine was screaming now. The temperature gauge was climbing. The oil pressure was fluctuating. She was pushing the aircraft beyond its design limits, but she needed every bit of speed she could get. The lead BF-109 opened fire at 1,200 yards, way too far for effective shooting. The maximum effective range for aircraft guns in a head-on engagement was maybe 600 yards. At 1,200 yards, you were just wasting ammunition and giving away your position. The tracers fell short, arcing down toward the sea hundreds of yards in front of Carter's Spitfire. Carter did not return fire. She kept climbing. She wanted to see what the German pilot would do. Would he hold course? Would he commit? Or would he break off? The range closed. 1,000 yards, 800 yards, 600 yards. The German pilot fired again. Another long burst. Tracers filling the air between the two aircraft. Some of them passed close enough that Carter could see them. Bright streaks of fire, moving impossibly fast. At 500 yards, the lead BF-109 broke off. The pilot rolled hard right and dove away, just like Carter had predicted. The rest of the formation followed, 8 BF-109s scattering like startled birds. They had blinked. They had not expected Carter to hold course. They had not expected her to climb directly into their attack. So they had broken. Human nature, self-preservation, the same instinct that kept you alive in normal situations could get you killed in combat if you let it control your decisions. Carter leveled off and keyed her radio. She told her flight to reform and vector toward the bombers. The escorts were scattered. The bombers were alone. This was the opportunity they needed. Davies, Thompson, and Singh rejoined on her wings. The 4 Spitfires turned north and accelerated. The German bombers were climbing now, trying to get back to altitude after their emergency descent when the escorts had scattered. They were spread out over 5 miles of sky, no formation, no mutual support, just individual aircraft trying to get home. Carter picked the nearest Junkers 88 and dove on it from behind. The Junkers 88 was a fast bomber, maximum speed of 292 miles per hour. But that was nothing compared to a Spitfire in a dive. Carter closed the distance in seconds. The bomber's rear gunner saw her coming and opened fire at 800 yards. Carter could see the muzzle flashes from the defensive gun, tracers arcing toward her. She jinked left, then right, throwing off the gunner's aim. The bullets passed harmlessly to the side. Carter closed to 300 yards before firing, close enough to see the rivets on the bomber's fuselage, close enough to see the faces of the crew through the greenhouse nose. She pressed her firing buttons. The Hispano cannons thumped. Her cannon shells walked up the bomber's fuselage. She saw strikes on the tail, then the midsection, then the left engine. The engine cowling ripped open. Oil and coolant sprayed into the air. Flames erupted from the engine nacelle. The Junkers 88 began a slow roll to the left. The pilot was fighting it, trying to keep the wings level, but the drag from the damaged engine was too much. The bomber rolled inverted and started to descend. Carter saw parachutes deploying, 3 of them. The crew was bailing out. Smart decision. That aircraft was not flying anymore. Carter pulled up and looked for another target. Davies was engaging a Junkers 88 to the east. She could see his tracers converging on the bomber. Thompson and Singh were chasing 2 more bombers that were trying to run for Naples. The bombers had jettisoned their bombs and were running for home at full throttle, but they were not fast enough. Carter spotted a lone Junkers 88 at 12,000 feet, flying straight and level. Strange. Why would a bomber be flying straight and level in the middle of a combat zone? She turned toward it and dove. As she closed, she realized why it was flying straight. The pilot was already dead. The cockpit was shattered. The greenhouse nose was gone. Torn off by cannon fire from an earlier engagement, the entire crew was gone. Killed by fragments, probably. The bomber was flying itself, a ghost ship. It would fly until it ran out of fuel or until the autopilot failed. Then it would descend into the sea. Carter pulled alongside and looked. The aircraft was riddled with holes, hundreds of them, bullet and cannon damage from multiple engagements. This bomber had been shot to pieces, but it was still flying. The Junkers 88 was a tough aircraft. German engineering, built to take punishment and keep going, but no crew meant it was no longer a threat. Carter pulled away and climbed back to altitude. She checked her fuel. Half tanks, enough for another 10 minutes of combat, enough to get home if she turned south now. She scanned the sky one more time. The German formation was gone, scattered, broken, running for home. Some of the Bf-109s were reforming north of her position, but they were not attacking. They were in defensive formation, protecting themselves, not going after Allied fighters. The entire engagement had lasted 4 minutes. From the initial dive to this moment, 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the German raid had been completely disrupted. Carter radioed ground control and reported the results. Enemy formation dispersed, multiple bombers destroyed or damaged, multiple fighters destroyed, no friendly losses. Her voice was steady, professional, but her hands were shaking on the control stick, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the realization of what she had just done. Ground control acknowledged and told her to return to base. Carter turned south and headed for Crotone. Her Spitfire felt different now, lighter. She had fired most of her ammunition. The aircraft was more responsive without the weight. She trimmed it for cruise and let it fly itself for a moment while she took a breath. She had just done something no one else had tried, a deliberate head-on attack against a superior force, and it had worked. The math had been correct. The psychology had been correct. The Germans had not expected anyone to be crazy enough to fly straight at them at full speed, and that surprise had given Carter's flight the advantage they needed. But Carter knew this would not work forever. The Germans would adapt. They would figure out a counter. They would train their pilots to hold course in head-on engagements. And when that happened, the tactic would become suicide. But for now, it worked. And in war, you used what worked until it stopped working. Then you invented something new. At 14:20 hours, Carter landed at Crotone. The runway was dirt and gravel, rough. The Spitfire bounced twice before settling onto its landing gear. She taxied to the dispersal area and shut down the engine. The Merlin coughed twice and went silent. The sudden quiet was disorienting after the constant roar of the engine. Wing Commander Hastings was waiting on the flight line. He was standing next to a jeep with his arms crossed. His face was unreadable. Carter could not tell if he was angry or impressed or something else entirely. She climbed out of her Spitfire and walked over to him. Her legs were stiff. She had been in the cockpit for 2 hours. Her back ached from the G-forces. Her hands were still shaking slightly. Hastings waited until she was standing in front of him. Then he asked what the hell had just happened. His tone was neutral, not angry, not pleased, just curious. Carter took a breath and explained the engagement step by step. The head-on pass. The 4 Bf-109s destroyed in the initial attack. The chaos it created. The German formation breaking apart. The second group of Bf-109s that had turned away when she climbed into their attack. The bombers scattering. The raid disrupted. Hastings asked if she realized what she had just done. Carter said yes. She had proven that head-on attacks could work if executed correctly. Hastings shook his head. He said ground observers had counted 12 German fighters going down. 12. In 4 minutes. Carter blinked. 12? She had counted 4 that her flight had destroyed in the initial pass. Then 2 bombers, maybe a third damaged. But 12 fighters? Hastings explained. Other RAF squadrons had been in the area. They had seen the German formation scatter. They had seen the chaos. They had taken advantage of it. They had hit the scattered German fighters while they were disorganized and vulnerable. The head-on attack had not just destroyed 4 fighters, it had created the conditions for other squadrons to destroy 8 more. Carter had not realized that. She had been focused on her own engagement. She had not thought about the ripple effects. But Hastings had. He understood what had happened. One aggressive action by 4 aircraft had created opportunities for dozens of other aircraft. That was force multiplication. That was how you won air battles when you were outnumbered. Hastings asked if Carter had lost her mind. Carter said no. She had just proven that conventional tactics were not the only option. Sometimes you had to do the thing no one expected. Sometimes you had to take a calculated risk. Sometimes you had to scare the enemy more than they scared you. Hastings told her to stand down for the rest of the day. He needed to debrief her flight and write a report for group headquarters. This was going to generate attention. A lot of attention. Group would want details. They would want to know if this could be repeated. They would want to know if other squadrons could use the same tactic. Carter walked to the operations tent and sat down. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat. The cockpit of a Spitfire got hot. Even at high altitude, the canopy acted like a greenhouse. Davies, Thompson, and Singh were already in the tent. They were going over the gun camera footage. Each Spitfire had a camera mounted behind the windscreen that activated whenever the guns fired. The footage showed exactly what had happened. Carter watched over their shoulders. The footage confirmed what she had seen. 4 Bf-109s destroyed in the initial pass. The gun cameras showed the impacts, the strikes on the fuselages, the pieces flying off, the aircraft rolling and falling. It was brutal footage, clinical, no Hollywood drama, just the reality of air combat. You fired, the bullets hit, the aircraft broke, men died. Thompson looked up at Carter and asked if they were going to do this again. His voice was steady, but Carter could hear the underlying question. Was this a one-time thing? Or was this the new normal? Carter said probably, if it worked once, it would work again. Until the Germans adapted, until they figured out how to counter a head-on attack. But until then, the tactic gave the Allies an advantage. And you used every advantage you could get. Singh asked how long that would take. How long before the Germans adapted? Carter said maybe a week, maybe a month. German pilots were not stupid. They would figure it out. They would start holding course in head-on engagements. They would train for it. And when that happened, head-on attacks would become much more dangerous. The 2-second engagement window would become a mutual slaughter, both sides firing, both sides taking hits. It would come down to who had better armor, better luck. Davies asked what would happen when the Germans adapted. What would they do then? Carter said they would invent something else. That was how air combat worked. Action, reaction, counter-reaction. You stayed ahead or you died. The side that adapted faster won. The side that stuck with obsolete tactics lost. The 3 pilots nodded. They understood. This was the reality of combat in 1943. Nothing stayed the same. Every advantage was temporary. You exploited it while you could. Then you moved on to the next thing. Now, if you are still watching, I want you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. I know you hear that on every video you watch, but here is why it actually matters. These stories, the ones about people like Emily Carter, they are not in the history books. They are not taught in schools. The only way anyone knows about them is because people like you care enough to watch and share. When you subscribe, you are telling us to keep digging, keep finding these stories, keep making sure they do not disappear. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, be part of this. Now, back to Carter. The second engagement happened 3 days later, on September 15th. The Luftwaffe had regrouped and was hitting Salerno again. They had learned from the first raid. This time they sent a larger formation, 50-plus aircraft, bombers and fighters, more escorts, tighter formation. They were not going to let themselves get surprised again. Carter's squadron was scrambled at 0940 hours. The alert siren wailed across the airfield. Pilots ran to their aircraft. Ground crews were already turning over engines. The Spitfires were fueled and armed, ready to go. Carter led 8 Spitfires this time, not 4. Word of her head-on tactic had spread through the wing. Other pilots wanted to try it. They wanted to see if it would work for them the way it had worked for Carter. Wing Commander Hastings had authorized a full squadron test, 8 aircraft instead of 4. If it worked again, it would become standard doctrine. If it failed, it would be abandoned. The stakes were higher now. More pilots, more aircraft, more risk. Carter briefed her pilots before takeoff. The briefing was short. They had all heard the stories from the first engagement. They knew what to expect. Same plan as before. Climb to altitude, identify the lead escort group, turn into them at full speed, commit fully, and do not break off under any circumstances. The goal was disruption, not individual kills. Make the Germans scatter, create openings for the rest of the wing to exploit. But Carter added one more instruction. If the Germans held course in a head-on pass, do not break off. Hold your course. Keep firing. The engagement window was 2 seconds, maybe less. In that window, the side with better aim and stronger nerves would win. Do not flinch. Do not break. Commit. The squadron took off at 0950 hours. 8 Spitfires in 2 flights of 4. Carter led the first flight. Squadron leader Morrison led the second. They climbed to 24,000 feet and positioned themselves northwest of the beachhead. Higher than the first engagement, Carter wanted the altitude advantage. It gave them more energy, more speed in the dive. At 10:15 hours, ground control reported the German formation inbound. Altitude 19,000 feet, heading south. Speed 220 miles per hour. Carter spotted them at 10:20 hours. The formation was even larger than intelligence had reported. She counted at least 30 fighters escorting 20 bombers, maybe more. Hard to get an exact count at this distance. The Germans were flying a different formation this time, not the standard escort pattern from September 12th. They had adapted already. The fighters were stacked in layers above the bombers. High cover at 22,000 feet, middle cover at 20,000 feet, close escort at 18,000 feet, 3 layers of defense. This was a heavily defended formation. A conventional attack from the rear would get chewed up by the layered escorts before it could reach the bombers. Carter made her decision. She would hit the high cover first, break the top layer, and the rest would lose confidence. The formation would unravel from the top down. She keyed her radio and told her squadron to follow her in. 8 Spitfires rolled into a dive. They were aimed at the high cover group. 12 Bf-109s at 22,000 feet. The Germans saw them coming, but this time they did not maneuver defensively. They turned into the attack. Carter realized what was happening. The Luftwaffe had adapted faster than she expected. They were not going to scatter this time. They were going to try the same tactic. Head-on pass, full commitment, no breaking off. The 2 formations closed at a combined speed of over 700 miles per hour. Carter kept her Spitfire steady. She could see the lead, Bf-109, growing larger in her gun sight. The yellow nose cone, the black cross on the fuselage, the propeller spinning so fast it was just a blur. The German pilot was doing the same thing she was doing, holding course, waiting for the other side to flinch. At 600 yards, Carter opened fire. The German pilot opened fire at the same time. Tracers crossed in the space between the aircraft, red and orange streaks moving at impossible speed. Carter felt impacts on her Spitfire, cannon shells hitting the wings, machine gun bullets punching through the fuselage. She kept firing, kept flying straight. The sound was incredible. The roar of her own guns, the crack of impacts, the scream of the engine at full throttle. The Bf-109 was filling her windscreen now. She could see the pilot's face. Young, maybe 20 years old. His eyes were wide. He was holding course, not flinching. Carter kept firing. Her tracers were hitting the Bf-109. She saw strikes on the wings, on the engine cowling, pieces flying off. Then they passed. The German fighter flashed past Carter's canopy with less than 10 feet of clearance, so close she could see the oil streaks on the underside of the wings, so close she felt the turbulence from his prop wash. Her Spitfire shuddered. The controls went mushy for a second. Then they firmed up again. Carter pulled back on the stick and climbed. Behind her, the sky was full of fighters. Spitfires and Bf-109s tangled in a massive furball. No formations anymore. No tactics. Just individual combats scattered across 5 miles of sky. Aircraft turning and diving and climbing. Tracers everywhere. The radio was chaos. Pilots calling out targets, calling for help, calling warnings. Carter scanned for targets. Her Spitfire was handling sluggishly. Something was wrong. She checked her instruments. Oil pressure was dropping. Temperature was rising. One of the cannon hits from the head-on pass had damaged her engine. Severed an oil line, probably. She had maybe 5 minutes before the engine seized. Maybe less. Carter saw a Bf-109 diving on one of her squadron mates. A Spitfire was turning hard, trying to shake the German fighter, but the Bf-109 was staying with him. The German pilot was good, experienced. He was leading his target perfectly. In another 2 seconds, he would be in firing position. Carter rolled inverted and pulled into a pursuit curve. She needed to cover that angle fast. The Spitfire protested. The damaged engine was losing power. The oil pressure gauge was reading almost 0 now, but Carter pulled harder, G's crushing her into the seat, vision narrowing. She got the Bf-109 in her gun sight and fired a 3-second burst. The cannon shells hit the Bf-109's tail section. The rudder disintegrated. Control cables severed. The German pilot lost directional control. The aircraft went into a spin. Carter saw the pilot trying to correct, but it was hopeless. A spin at low altitude with no rudder was unrecoverable. The Bf-109 went down. Carter pulled out of the turn and climbed back to altitude, or tried to. Her engine coughed, sputtered. The propeller was windmilling now, not producing thrust. She was gliding. She keyed her radio and told her squadron she was heading back to base. Engine damage. Davies acknowledged and said he would cover her withdrawal. Carter turned south and started descending. She needed to nurse the Spitfire home. 8 miles to Crotone, 8 miles with no engine. She trimmed the aircraft for best glide. The Spitfire descended at 800 feet per minute in a perfect glide. No power, just airspeed and altitude. Carter did the math in her head. 8 miles at 120 miles per hour was 4 minutes. At 800 feet per minute descent, she would lose 3,200 feet. She was at 8,000 feet now. That would put her at 4,800 feet over the airfield. Enough for a safe landing, but that assumed no turbulence, no downdrafts, no problems. In combat, there were always problems. At 10:48 hours, Carter crossed the coast. She could see Crotone ahead. The runway was visible. A long strip of dirt and gravel cutting through the scrub. She was at 5,000 feet. She had altitude to spare. Good. She lowered her landing gear. The hydraulics were still working. The gear locked down with a reassuring thunk. She lowered her flaps. More drag. The descent rate increased. She adjusted her glide path and aimed for the near end of the runway. She would have one chance at this. No go-around, no second attempt. The Spitfire was a glider now. It would land on this pass, or it would crash. At 10:50 hours, Carter touched down. The main wheels hit first, then the tail wheel. The Spitfire bounced once, settled, rolled down the runway. Carter applied brakes gently. Too much brake pressure and the aircraft would nose over. She let it roll to a stop halfway down the runway. She sat in the cockpit for a moment, breathing. Her hands were shaking again, not from adrenaline this time, from the realization of how close that had been. If the engine had seized 3 minutes earlier, she would not have made it back. She would be swimming in the Mediterranean right now, or sinking. Carter shut down the remaining systems and climbed out. Her Spitfire was a mess. Cannon holes in both wings, fragments from 20mm shells embedded in the fuselage, a severed oil line trailing fluid across the tarmac. The engine cowling was peppered with bullet holes. She had been lucky. If one of those shells had hit 6 inches to the left, it would have taken off her head. Wing Commander Hastings drove up in a jeep. He looked at Carter's Spitfire and shook his head slowly. He said she was grounded until a medical officer cleared her. Regulations required a medical check after any aircraft damage from enemy fire. Carter said she was fine. Hastings said that was not his decision. Protocol was protocol. Carter spent the next 2 hours being examined by a flight surgeon. The doctor checked her pupils, her reflexes, asked about headaches, dizziness, nausea. Carter said she felt fine. The doctor said she had minor bruising from the G-forces, but no injuries, no concussion, no signs of shock. He cleared her for flight operations and told her to take the rest of the day off. Carter ignored the advice and walked to the operations tent. She wanted to know the results of the engagement. The intelligence officer was still compiling reports, but he had preliminary numbers. 8 German fighters confirmed destroyed by Carter's squadron, 4 probables, 3 bombers destroyed, 2 damaged. Allied losses, 2 Spitfires damaged, including Carter's, 1 pilot wounded, 0 pilots killed. The head-on tactic had worked again, but the cost was higher this time. The Germans had adapted faster than Carter expected. They were willing to fly head-on passes now. That changed the calculus completely. It was no longer about who flinched first. It was about who survived the 2-second window when both sides were firing at point-blank range. Carter sat down and started writing a report for Wing Commander Hastings. She needed to document what had worked and what had not worked. The tactic was still effective, but it required modification. She recommended limiting head-on passes to situations where the Allies had numerical superiority or altitude advantage. 8 Spitfires against 12 Bf-109s was acceptable risk. 8 Spitfires against 30 Bf-109s would be suicide now that the Germans were holding course. She also recommended better armor protection for Spitfire pilots. The current setup had a steel plate behind the seat, thick enough to stop rifle-caliber bullets and most shell fragments, but nothing in front. In a head-on engagement, fragments could come through the windscreen. She had been lucky. The shells that hit her aircraft had missed her by inches. The next pilot might not be that lucky. Wing Commander Hastings read Carter's report and forwarded it to Group Headquarters. Group forwarded it to Command. By September 20th, Carter's head-on tactic was being discussed at the highest levels of RAF Fighter Command. Some officers thought it was brilliant. Some thought it was reckless. Everyone agreed it was getting results. On September 22nd, Carter received new orders. She was being reassigned to the Fighter Leaders School at Millfield in Scotland. Her job would be to teach the head-on tactic to other squadron leaders. Command wanted the technique, standardized and spread across all fighter wings operating in the Mediterranean and Northwest Europe. Carter packed her kit and flew back to England on September 25th. She spent the next 3 months at Millfield teaching tactics to pilots from British, American, Canadian, Australian, and Polish squadrons. She ran simulations, analyzed gun camera footage, and refined the doctrine. By December, the head-on tactic was official RAF policy. It had a name now, Frontal Engagement Doctrine. Pilots were taught when to use it and when to avoid it. The key variables were altitude, speed, numerical advantage, and pilot experience. Green pilots were not authorized to attempt head-ons, only experienced flight leaders. Carter returned to combat operations in January 1944. She was assigned to a new squadron, No. 72 Squadron, operating Spitfire Mark 9s out of southern England. The mission was air superiority over France in preparation for the coming invasion. The Luftwaffe was still active over the continent, but their numbers were declining. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the constant pressure from Allied bombing raids were wearing them down. Carter flew 83 more sorties between January and June of 1944. She engaged German fighters 11 times. She used the head-on tactic twice. Both times it worked. The Germans scattered, but by June, the Luftwaffe was barely contesting Allied air superiority. The head-on tactic became unnecessary because there were fewer targets. On June 6th, Carter flew 3 sorties over Normandy. She saw the invasion fleet, she saw the beaches, she saw thousands of Allied soldiers pushing inland. German fighters were almost non-existent. The Luftwaffe had been broken. Air superiority was complete. Carter's contribution to that success was significant but largely unrecognized. Her head-on tactic had been used hundreds of times by Allied pilots between September 1943 and June 1944. It had accounted for dozens of German aircraft destroyed and countless more driven off before they could attack bombers or ground forces, but because the tactic was now standard doctrine, no single pilot received credit. It was just part of how the RAF fought. Carter did not mind. She had never been interested in personal recognition. She had been interested in solving a problem. The problem was how to break up heavily escorted German bomber formations. The solution was a head-on pass at full commitment. The problem was solved. That was enough. Before we get to the rest of Carter's story, I need to ask you for something. If you are finding value in this video, if you appreciate these deep dives into forgotten history, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it makes a massive difference. Every like pushes this video to more people who care about history, more people who want to remember the men and women who did extraordinary things during the war. And if you have not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We put out videos like this all the time. Real stories, real people, no fluff. Just history the way it should be told. Subscribe, turn on notifications, be part of this community. Now, back to Carter. Carter was promoted to wing commander in July of 1944. She was given command of an entire wing, 3 squadrons, 36 aircraft. Her area of operations was northern France and Belgium. The mission was ground attack and air superiority in support of the advancing Allied armies. The war was moving fast now. The Germans were retreating. Allied forces were pushing east. Carter's wing flew close air support missions, hitting German convoys, trains, and troop concentrations. Luftwaffe opposition was sporadic. Most German fighters had been pulled back to defend the Reich from American daylight bombing raids. On August 17th, Carter's wing was tasked with attacking a German armored column near Falaise. Intelligence reported at least 50 tanks and armored vehicles trying to escape the Allied encirclement. Carter led 24 Spitfires armed with 500-pound bombs and rockets. The weather was terrible: low clouds, rain, poor visibility. Carter descended below the cloud base and found the German column. It was moving east on a narrow road, vehicles packed nose to tail. Carter radioed her wing and set up the attack. Flights would go in one at a time, dropping bombs and firing rockets, then climbing back into the clouds to regroup. Carter led the first pass. She dove on the lead vehicle and released her bombs at 2,500 feet. The bombs hit directly on the road. The explosions destroyed 3 vehicles and blocked the route. The rest of the column was trapped. Carter's wing made 8 more passes over the next 20 minutes. By the time they were done, the entire column was burning. Carter returned to base and filed her report. 50-plus vehicles destroyed or damaged, 0 friendly losses, ground forces moving in to mop up. Command was pleased. This was the kind of result they needed: fast, decisive, overwhelming air support. Carter's wing continued operations through August and into September. They hit targets across Belgium and into the Netherlands. By October, the front line had stabilized. The Germans were dug in. The Allies were preparing for the final push into Germany. Carter was exhausted. She had been flying combat operations for over a year with only brief breaks. She had flown 230 sorties. She had seen dozens of pilots killed. She had watched friends die in burning aircraft. She was done. In November of 1944, Carter requested a transfer to non-combat duties. Command approved. She was reassigned to RAF Henlow as an instructor. Her job was training new pilots in fighter tactics. She spent the rest of the war teaching the next generation of RAF pilots how to survive in combat. She taught them the head-on tactic. She taught them energy management. She taught them how to think 3 moves ahead. Most of her students never saw combat. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945 before they finished training, but the lessons Carter taught them became part of RAF doctrine for the next generation of fighter pilots. Carter was discharged from the RAF in September of 1945. Wing Commander, Distinguished Flying Cross with bar, mentioned in dispatches twice. She had flown 230 combat sorties. She had seen dozens of pilots killed, friends, squadron mates, good pilots who had made small mistakes that cost them everything. She had watched aircraft burn. She had watched parachutes fail to open. She had seen things that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She returned to civilian life and tried to forget the war. But you do not forget war. You just learn to live with it. She enrolled at Cambridge and studied aeronautical engineering. She wanted to understand the physics behind the tactics she had used. She wanted to know why aircraft behaved the way they did, why some designs worked and others failed, why pilots lived or died based on decisions made by engineers years before the aircraft ever flew. She graduated in 1948 at the top of her class. Her thesis was on high-speed aerodynamics and compressibility effects, the things that happened to aircraft when they approached the speed of sound, the buffeting, the control reversal, the shock waves that could tear an aircraft apart. She had felt some of those effects in combat. She wanted to understand them. De Havilland Aircraft Company offered her a job before she finished her thesis. They needed engineers who understood both the theory and the practice of flight. Carter accepted. She went to work designing fighter aircraft for the next generation, the de Havilland Venom, a single-seat fighter bomber that entered service with the RAF in 1952. Then the de Havilland Sea Vixen, a twin-seat all-weather interceptor that served with the Royal Navy from 1959 to 1972. Both aircraft incorporated lessons Carter had learned in combat. The Venom had better armor protection around the cockpit than the Spitfire. The Sea Vixen had redundant systems so that battle damage would not immediately cripple the aircraft. These were not revolutionary features. They were practical improvements based on combat experience, based on what actually happened when aircraft got shot at. In the 1950s, Carter married another former RAF pilot, squadron leader James Whitmore. He had flown Lancasters during the war, night bombing missions over Germany, different kind of flying than fighters, but the same underlying reality. You went up, you did your job, you tried to come home. Sometimes you did not. They had 2 children, a daughter born in 1953, a son born in 1955. Carter never spoke to her children about the war, not about the head-on tactic, not about the 12 Bf-109s destroyed in 4 minutes over Salerno, not about the fear or the adrenaline or the friends she had lost. It was a different life, a life she had moved past. She was an engineer now, a mother, not a fighter pilot, but in 1963, a military. Historian researching RAF tactics in the Mediterranean theater found references to Carter's head-on engagement doctrine in archived squadron reports, documents that had been classified for 20 years, reports from Wing Commander Hastings, gun camera analysis, tactical evaluations. The historian realized this was significant. This was a tactic that had changed how the RAF fought air battles in 1943 and 1944, and nobody knew about it. He contacted Carter through de Havilland and asked if she would be willing to be interviewed for his research. Carter hesitated. She had not talked about the war in 18 years, but she agreed. The interview took place at her home in Surrey. It lasted 4 hours. The historian asked detailed questions about the development of the tactic, the mathematics, the psychology, the execution. Carter answered all of them with the same precision she had brought to engineering. The interview was published in the Journal of Military History in 1964. It was a dry, technical account of the development and implementation of frontal engagement tactics between 1943 and 1944. No heroism, no drama, just facts. Diagrams showing attack angles, tables showing engagement windows and closure rates, analysis of German responses and Allied counter-responses. The article was read by a few hundred military historians and aviation enthusiasts. It did not make headlines. Carter did not expect it to. She had done her job. She had solved a problem. She had documented the solution. That was all. The article became a footnote in the history of World War II air combat, occasionally cited by researchers, occasionally referenced in books about fighter tactics, but mostly forgotten. Carter continued working for de Havilland until her retirement in 1970. She and her husband moved to Cornwall and lived quietly. They traveled. They spent time with their grandchildren. They did not talk about the war. Carter passed away in 1998. She was 84 years old. Her obituary in the Times mentioned her work as an aeronautical engineer. It mentioned her contribution to British aircraft design. It mentioned her service in the RAF during World War II. It did not mention the head-on tactic or the engagement over Salerno. Most people who knew Carter had no idea what she had done during the war. Her children did not learn the full story until after her death, when they found a box of her papers in the attic of the Cornwall house. Inside were squadron reports, gun camera stills, a logbook with 230 combat sorties documented in careful handwriting, and a handwritten note from Wing Commander Hastings dated September 15, 1943. The note said, "Your tactic worked. You saved lives. Well done." Carter's story was almost lost. But in 2004, a researcher at the RAF Museum found her archived reports while cataloging documents from the Mediterranean campaign. He realized the significance of what she had accomplished. She had invented a tactic that changed how the RAF fought. Air battles in 1943 and 1944. She had led from the front. She had put her own life at risk to prove the concept, and she had succeeded. The RAF Museum now has a small display dedicated to Carter in the World War II section. It includes her logbook, photographs from her service, gun camera stills from the September 12th engagement, and a brief description of the head-on tactic. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It is not the flashiest exhibit. No dramatic music, no video screens, just a few artifacts and some text explaining what happened. But for those who do stop and read, the story is clear. One woman, one idea, one moment of courage. 12 German fighters destroyed in 4 minutes, a raid broken, lives saved, an invasion secured, and then decades of quiet life as an engineer and mother, never seeking credit, never asking for recognition. That is the part that gets me. She could have made herself famous. She could have written a book. She could have done interviews. She could have told everyone what she did. But she did not. She just went back to her life and did her work and raised her family. Because that is what people like Emily Carter did. They did extraordinary things when it mattered. Then they went home and lived ordinary lives, no fanfare, no drama, just quiet competence. If this story meant something to you, I need you to do one final thing. Hit that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, somewhere else? Let us know. Tell us if you had family who served. Tell us if you knew someone like Emily Carter. Tell us anything. Just let us know you were here, because that is how we keep these stories alive, not by letting them sit in archives, but by sharing them, by talking about them, by making sure people remember. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about history. And thank you for making sure Emily Carter is not forgotten. She deserves better than silence. And you just made sure she got it.